In video lecture series 4, dear learners, welcome to video lecture series 4 for BA first semester political science paper Introduction to the Political Theory. I am Dr. Deepak Kumar Kashyap, assistant professor at Pandit Sundarlal Sarma Open University. Today we are going to explore one of the most fundamental concepts in modern political theory and its approaches. Basically, it developed strongly after major historical events such as the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the World War. Thinkers like John Locke emphasized natural rights and limited government. Karl Marx also focuses on class struggle and economic power, and John Rawls introduced modern theories of justice and fairness. There are several key approaches in modern political theory. The liberal approach emphasizing individual rights, freedom, and democracy, and the Marxist approach analyzing power through economic structure and class relation, where the feminist approach highlights gender inequality and the role of patriarchy in politics, and the postmodern approach questions universal truth and examine how language and power shape political realities.
In a first slide, we talk about modern political theory. Basically, in modern political theory refers to the emergence in the 19th and 20th century that departing from purely philosophical speculation to engage with the real world problems. Modern political theory is the study of political ideas, institutions, values, and power structures that shape contemporary society. It combining philosophical reasoning with empirical research. It mainly focuses on democracy, equality, liberty, and human rights, and engaging himself as an interdisciplinary insight from sociology, economics, and law, and addressing urgent global challenges from inequality to authoritarianism in both normative it meaning discuss what politics ought to be and empirical meaning it study how politics actually work in real life. Today modern political theory help us to understand democracy, human rights, globalization and social justice in a rapidly changing world. In second slide we basically differentiate the classical versus modern political theory. Will classical thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, which focused on imaging world, and the modern political theory takes a fundamentally different front grounded in evidence, responsive to diversity, and engaged with global complexity. If we compare classical and modern political theory, there are several points. The first point is that the classical theory focus on philosophical and speculative ideas, where modern political theory focused on scientific and analytical areas. Second, classical political theory focuses on ideal state, where modern political theory engage himself a real world politics. The third point, the classical theory focus on limited to small city states, where modern political theory addresses global issues and pluralism. Fourth, the classical theory, which have a minimal concern for individual rights, where modern theory have center rights and talks about equality and democracy. Fifth, the classical theory is elite-centered discourse, where the modern political theory uses data and empirical research, where we can see that the classical theory was largely philosophical and speculative, where modern political theory includes scientific and behavioral approach that uses observation and data. Classical theory emphasizes duties and virtues, while modern theory emphasizes rights and freedom. Thus, we can say that modern political theory is broader, more analytical, and closely connected to the real political problems. If we saw the key features of modern political theory, first is the interdisciplinary approach, second is scientific and analytical methods, the third is justice and equality, Fourth is democratic focus, and fifth is human right emphasis. These are the features of modern political theory, where we see in this overall we say that the modern political theory is not fixed or rigid. It constantly evolved to respond a new challenge into society and politics. And basically, the modern political theory it emphasizes individual rights and freedoms, and the protection of civil liberties, human rights, and equality before law are his central concerns. And second, it strongly support democracy and representative government because the values of participation, accountability, and rule of law comes from there. If we talk about the first approach which modern political theory have, the first approach is the normative approach. Basically, the normative approach is the one of the oldest and most enduring tradition in political theory. Rather than describing politics as it is, it asks the foundational question: what should the political system be like? If we saw the normative approach in political theory, basically it tries to define a just society and fair political institution. For examples, the Rawls proposed principles of justice, which is based on fairness and equality of opportunity. Normative theory is a philosophical theory in nature, and it concerned with the ethical reasoning. Normative theorists engage in his moral reasoning about the principle that ought to be guide political life. They evaluate institutions against ideals of justice, liberty, and equality, arguing that the politics is never value free and that scholars have responsibility to articulate what a good society look like. Although this approach is important because politics cannot be separated from values. Without moral standard, it would be difficult to judge whether laws and policies are fair or unjust. Normative political theory provides a guidance for improving political system and protecting human dignity, although critics argues that it may be too idealistic, but the normative approach remains central to political theory because it gives direction and purpose to political life. If we saw the two thinkers which have a more contribution in normative approach, first is the John Rawls and second is the Robert Nozick. In John Rawls, in his famous book A Theory of Justice, which is published in 1971, where he introduced the concept of well of ignorance, where he argues that the fair principles of justice are those people who choose if they did not know their place in society, and his concept of justice as fairness received his liberal political philosophy. Second, the normative thinker is Robert Nozick. In Robert Nozick, in his book Snarky, State and Utopia, which is published in 1974, Nozick challenged the roles with a libertarian vision. He argued for a minimal state, limited to protection against force and fraud and cheating that are any redistribution of wealth and violates individual rights to property and ownership. And these give a brief discussion about the normative approach. Second approach is the behavioral approach. Basically, behavioral approach is emerged after World War II. The behavior revolution task for political science by instincting that the discipline which adopt the rigorous methods of natural science. Behaviorists argued that the political theory had been too speculative and philosophical and it needed to become measurable, observable, and testable. The behavioral approach examine how individual vote, how political party functions, how leader make decisions, and how institutions operates. They use methods such as like survey, interview, statistical analysis, and data collection. The main goal of this approach is objectivity and empirical verification. It avoids moral judgment and focuses on fact and measurable evidence. Behavioralism helped transform political science into a more systematic and research-based discipline. Rather than debating what governments should look like, behaviorists ask how people actually behave in politics. They turned to survey, statistical analysis, and control studies of voting pattern, public opinion, and political participation to answer that question. However, critics argue that it ignores values and ethical questions. Despite this criticism, the behavior approach contributed significantly to modern political analysis by introducing scientific techniques and empirical research. If it's third approach, the Marxist approach, if we talk about the Marxist approach, it is rooted in the thought of Karl Marx. The Marxist approach insists the economic structure are the foundation of all political life. Politics, law, culture, and ideology are the shaped by and serve the interest of the class that controls the means of production. In Marxist approach, there have the four bases of his theory. First is the class struggle. Second, economic base shape the politics. Third, state as an instrument for bourgeois class. And fourth is the classless society. Basically, the Marxist approach have have divided society into two main classes. The first is bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who sell the labor. Marx argued that the state serves the interest of the ruling class and maintains economic inequality, and politics is not neutral but reflect the dominant economic system. The Marxist approach emphasized exploitation, alienation, and the need for revolutionary change. But finally, we can say that this approach criticizes capitalism and advocates for a classless society where resources are equally distributed. Lastly, Marxist theory has influenced many political movements and revolutions around the world. Some of the modern Marxist thinkers like Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser. Antonio Gramsci knows for his concept of cultural hegemony, and Louis Althusser knows the concept of ideological state and its apparatus. From this, we can talk about the next approach, the liberal approach. Basically, liberal approach is emphasizing individual freedom, equality, constitutional government, and rule of law. It is basically developed from the ideas of Locke and later thinkers like Rawls. Liberalism believes that individuals have natural rights that must be protected by the state, and the role of government should be limited and based on consent. Democracy, free election, and protection of civil liberty are the essential elements of liberal theory. In liberal approach, we can say the four bases. First is the individual freedom, second is the rule of law, third is the limited government, and fourth is the democratic governments. Now, modern liberalism also supports social welfare measures to reduce inequality. It promotes pluralism, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence. So, we can say that the liberal approach remains one of the most influential traditions in modern political theory. In modern liberal thinkers like Mill and Berlin have a too much contribution in the liberal approach, where J.S. Mill called the champion of democracy and champion of individual freedom, where Isaiah Berlin known as for his two concept of liberty. First is negative liberty and second is the positive liberty. So basically, we can say that liberal approach basically focus on the individuals rather than state or society. Then the next approach is the feminist approach. In feminist approach, basically talks about the response to the exclusion of women from the political life and political thought. Traditionally, political theory was largely written by the men and focused mainly on public life, where he ignoring women's experience in the private sphere such as family, household, labor, and caregiving. Feminist basically talks about the 4 points where he talk first is the gender equality, second he criticized the patriarchy, third she wants uh, a political rights like men, and they criticize the structure patriarchy structure which can discriminate among them. So basically, the feminist approach, one of the feminist thinker, Manny Wollstonecraft, argues that the woman should have equal rights, especially in education and political participation. In the 20th century, Simone de Beauvoir explained how society constructed women as the other, limited their freedom and opportunity. They, there are the two thinkers, feminist thinkers, Simone de Beauvoir and Carol Petman. So, in their idea, they are the radical. They are belong to the radical feminism, and they talk about the equally men's and women's rights. So, if we talk about the Simone de Beauvoir, in his book In the Second Sex, 1949, he argued that one is not born but rather becomes a woman, where she demonstrating the femininity is a social construction used to subordinate women, and talks about her work led to intellectual groundwork for second wave feminism. Second feminist is Carol Patman. In his book The Sexual Contract, 1988, she argued that the foundational social contract of liberal theory was in fact a sexual contract, one that secured men's political right over women. She revealed how patriarchy is woven into the very origin of modern political thought. So we can say that there are different strands of feminism where liberal feminism seeks equal legal rights, radical feminism challenges patriarchal system, socialist feminism connects gender inequality to capitalism, and intersectional feminism studies how gender interact with race, class, and caste. Overall, we can say that the feminist approach broadens political theory by including gender as a central category of analysis and demanding equality and justice for women in all areas. The next approach is the postmodern approach. This the postmodern approach challenges the traditional belief the political theory can provide universal truth or fixed principle. It argues that knowledge, truth, and power are socially constructed and shaped by the language, culture, and historical criticism. And postmodernism were represent a radical challenge to the entire enterprise of modern political theory, where other approaches seek universal truth about justice, power, or freedom, where postmodernists insist that there have no such universal truth exist, and all knowledge they argue is shaped by language, context, and power relations. If we saw that in concise, there are 3 points where postmodern political theory challenges. First is the universal truth. Postmodernist argues that all truth reflect particular perspective and interest. Second, fixed political meaning. Postmodernist argues that concepts like democracy or freedom shift across time and context. And third, grand theories, where postmodernists said that sweeping narratives about progress or liberation are themselves instrument of power. For postmodernists, power is not concentrated in the state. It operates diffusely through everyday language, institutions, and secular social practice. So we can say that although critics say it can be lead to relativism, postmodernism plays an important role in challenging rigid structure and encouraging critical thinking in political theory. The two postmodernist thinkers, Michael Foucault and Jacques Derrida, they give the concept of postmodernism and famous his contributions in these traditions of thinking. The last approach is critical theory approach. In critical theory approach, it is associated with the critical theory, particularly the thinkers of Frankfurt School. It developed in the 20th century as a response to capitalism, fascism, and mass culture. If we saw that the dominations of critical theory, firstly critique of they are the critique of capitalism. Second, they want cultural domination, and third, he want them emancipation from the traditions. So basically, critical theorists believe that the traditional political theory often support the status quo instead of simply describing society. The theory should aim to transform it. One of the important thinker, Jugan Habermas, he emphasizing the importance of communication, rational dialogue, and democratic participation in achieving social justice. Thus, the critical approach not only analyzes power but actively challenges operations and promotes transformations. In conclusion, we can say that the modern political theory highly relevant as it confronts global challenges including human rights, environment crisis, multiculturalism, and globalization. It combines normative inquiry, asking what ought to be, with critical analysis of existing political realities. In sum up, we say that modern political theory equips individual with the intellectual tools to question authority, promote justice, and work toward more inclusive and more democratic society. Thank you. Thank you so much.